Hi, welcome back to Homesteadish NC. I am Samantha Pate, and you are listening to the Spiritual Gardening Podcast. I do apologize. I want to welcome you all for coming here, and I apologize for the fact that this is not on Thursday. I actually was sick this week, and it was just, we had a lot going on, and I was not feeling well, and I didn't have much of a voice to be able to speak, so I had to wait until my voice healed completely, and I was very hopeful that I would have this podcast out by Saturday, and I'm very thankful that we were able to do that, and that this was able to give me time to change my message, because I had sat down, I had planned something else, I had researched and I had studied, and I was so excited. And then as soon as I was about to hit record to record this podcast, when I felt better, I immediately felt the need to change everything that I was studying. And so I decided to do something completely different. I wanted to do the story of David and Goliath. That's from 1 Samuel chapter 17. And I know that you are probably thinking, what does that have to do with gardening or homesteading? What does that have to do with spiritual gardening? And there are 5 things that I want to talk about, and then I want to read to you my children's favorite storybook on David and Goliath, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So I am going to go ahead and jump into it. I prayed before I started this podcast, because I knew that this podcast I only have 15 minutes because right now I'm not doing a paid version of podcast. I'm just doing the free version. So I only get 15 minutes to talk, and it's free speech, and I'm really excited about it. So let's get started. Number 1, something I learned from this is when David said someone should do something, but then he turned around and said, I will do something. The second thing I learned from this is that God doesn't call the qualified, God qualifies the called. The third thing I learned from this is that if God brings you to it, God will bring you through it. The fourth thing I learned from this is the simple moments in your life that you are in right now are preparing you for any battles that you are going to face ahead. And the fifth thing that I learned from this is that putting your faith in God is going to help you face the giants that are before you. And so I thought, what better way to go over in a quick period of time with a childlike mind, childlike heart, is by reading a child's storybook. And I know that certain details are left out, but it's the concept that I want you to understand from this in order to really grasp what all is going here. And this is just a random book from Dollar General. It's the Bible Rhyme Story Time, but it's my oldest son's favorite Bible story book. So here we go. Philistines were the enemies of God's people long ago. They planned to kill God's followers. They were an evil foe. God's army saw a sight one day that made them quake with fright. A giant 9 feet tall appeared. He was an awesome sight. Goliath was the giant's name. Oh, how he ranted and roared, and just the armor he wore weighed 100 pounds or more. Goliath shouted, "Come out and fight, and if I win, you'll see that you will all become our slaves, but if you win, you're free." God's army shook. They shook with fear. They turned to run away. There was no soldier brave enough, no soldier who would stay. But then appeared a shepherd boy. Yes, David was his name. He was braver than the men. He put them all to shame. Goliath speaks against our God. How can we let him go? I'll fight the giant by myself. I'm not afraid, you know. King Saul heard what David said and told him, "You're too small. Goliath is a fighting man. Goliath's much too tall." But David knew that when he fought, his God was always near. Saul offered David armor, but he dumped it with no fear. Then to the brook young David went and chose 5 round, smooth stones. Goliath saw him and he bragged, "Boy, I'll break your every bone." "You come at me," young David called, "with javelin and sword, and I come at you now in the name of the Almighty Lord. It's God who saves and God who gives. The battle is the Lord's." Then David took one smooth, hard stone, got ready for the swing, and with God's help and truest aim, the stone flew from the sling. It hit Goliath square and true. He fell with a loud cry. Both armies saw the Lord in charge, and they saw the giant die. The Philistines then turned and ran. There was no place to hide. God's army won the victory, for God was on their side. No more giant in the land, no army they could see, no enemy that took a stand. God set his people free. Such a cool story. It's such a cool part of history. It's such an amazing part in the Bible that just truly speaks on exactly what we're talking about as spiritual gardeners. You know, being rooted and built up in the faith and overflowing with thankfulness. You know, that's Colossians 2:7. But in this time, at this moment, David was just that. He was rooted in his faith. He knew that God had it, that God had already won. And because he knew that no matter what he did, that he was going to win because he had God on his side. I think that as spiritual gardeners, that's exactly what we need to hear. When cultivating your garden and growing in your faith and preparing your life and every day and just doing as you need to grow as you go, the reminder that in this time, you know, David did say someone should do something. But then he turned around and said, "I will do something." That's growth. That's growth to be able to say, "God, use me. Use me." You know, I'm small, I'm weak, I'm young, and I'm really inexperienced, but God, use me. And then, you know, in this, we're reminded that pretty much Saul thought that David was disqualified from this because of his age, his size, and his inexperience. But what we're reminded from this is that God doesn't call the qualified, but God qualifies the called. And through this, we learn that, you know, David's training in that moment, that simple moment of his life that he was in, where he was just a shepherd boy, was preparing him for a battle that he knew nothing about beforehand. You know, he left his flock. He left the fold, he left the sheep, he left them there. And, you know, he got someone else to watch over his sheep so that he could deliver some food to his brothers. And as he heard, he was like, why aren't we doing something? You know, it invoked in him a God use me mentality. And it just immediately, he had no fear with that. And in that simple moment in his life, you know, he had faced as a shepherd boy, he had been prepared for this moment. He didn't know that's what it was preparing him for. He didn't know that what he was doing in his everyday life was preparing him for the moments ahead, but it was, because lions and bears and whatever other creatures that would want to attack the lambs and attack the sheep, his job as the shepherd was to protect them. It was to care for them. It was to be their provider, their protector. And so if a bear is attacking one of his sheep, he is to attack back. He is to fight it off. And whether he fights it off and it lives another day, or whether he takes that slingshot and aims and kills it, he had been preparing for this moment. And then, we're reminded by this, that God, if he brings you to it, he's gonna bring you through it. He knew from the very beginning. He said, this is God's army. This is God's army. And so the battle has already been won. Your little haka dance that you're doing, and I don't know if you all know what a haka is, but that's what it reminded me of when Goliath was down in the valley and he was invoking fear on the Israel army, and he was trying to scare them using fear-mongering and scare tactics to have them shaking in their boots or sandals, and it was working. It was working at first. There was no one that was willing to stand up to that. And it reminded me so much of, I don't know if any of you watch rugby or anything like that, but my favorite team is New Zealand All Blacks. And something that they do before their games a lot of the time, or all the time, is a ritual called a haka. And that haka, there are many different reasons for doing a haka, but one thing that I notice is that it kind of invokes that fear. It shows power, it shows strength, and that makes me think of what Goliath was trying to do. He was scaring them. But the thing about it was the fact that putting your faith in God is going to help you face those giants in your way. And so David was not afraid. There was no way that he could be afraid, because he had faith that God was going to take care of him, that God was going to provide for him. And just to have that faith that's such an amazing thing. And so I want to talk about the importance of faith. And I know that so far in all the episodes of this podcast, I've touched on faith, but I believe that's important. It's probably the most important thing that we as Christians, as we are growing in our relationship with Christ, that we are growing in our faith. And that's, to me, to cultivate that and to understand where we're coming from and what God is calling us to do in our lives. And I don't know why I did all the research and studying for the other thing, and then as I sat down to do this landed in my mind and on my heart, and I just had to speak it. And I've been trying to do that because, like I told all of you before, is this for me. This is for me a journey of my spiritual growth, and I hope that as I go through this journey, that you are also able to learn something from it and grow with me, and that we can grow as we go. And just to me, that's a part of Homesteadish NC. That's what we're all about. If you would like to learn a little bit more about who we are and what we're doing, you can always go to www.homesteadishnc.com. I really appreciate you taking your time out to listen to our podcast. And if you will, follow and share. It helps us get the word out there, and it helps get this message out there. And although gardening and and homestead skills and all of that is so important to me. To me, it always circles back to my faith and my relationship with Jesus Christ. And I'm so excited to share that part of my family with you and that part of me with you. And I'm just so thankful for this opportunity. So thank you for listening, and I hope you join in next week. Our next podcast will be out on Thursday. So have a wonderful day.